Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. This week I'm going to restore this very worn out Peugeot Elan. This bike has been sat at the bottom of a garden for a whole year and it's our job to try to get it safe and rideable again. So we're going to strip it back to the frame, fix all the problems we uncover, fit all new bearings, new cables and detail the entire bike along the way. So it's going to be a massive job, but we'll talk you through it step by step. The first thing I noticed on this bike was the unbelievably wobbly hub. It had lots of play in it and it was tugging on the chain when freewheeling. We're going to rebuild that hub and uncover a huge problem causing that you'll see later in the video. One of the first things I noticed on this bike was when I was trying to change gear, it wasn't changing gear. You can see how that cable is pulling in that outer, the outer is moving without the derailleur shifting any way whatsoever. So that cable is actually seized in that outer along the way, and you can hear here brakes very creaky where they've obviously been weathered out. Any lubricant that was in them has been washed out in the rain, and then the sun, everything's dried it right out, so we need to sort that. You can see how we have this dent in the rim itself and also this tear in the tyre. So this has obviously been banged up a curb at some point. It's dented down this rim, but with it being steel we can save it. You can see how the tension has gone from the spokes in that area where it has flattened itself with that bend, but we're going to solve that one. Now I could tell when I was looking at this bike initially there was very little wear, and this chain really told us that. This is the original chain that was on the bike with very little wear in it, so we're going to actually clean this chain up and reuse it, and then also clean up most of the components and reuse pretty much everything on this bike. But what I will do is replace all the cables, all the tyres, all the tubes, brake pads, all the necessary parts as part of a service, and make sure that this bike is operating as new when we finish the restoration. So I'm taking out the wheels and then I will begin to take off the components. So initially I'm going to take off that rear derailleur. I could feel that was a little bit floppy on its derailleur hanger, and I'll show you why in a moment. So out comes the cable. This fitting, you have to be very careful if ever you're removing one of these. They're made of plastic, and obviously this is an older bike. We did manage to date this bike, and I'll show you how, that we have to be careful with that fitting to make sure we don't break it. And you could see there how it was rocking on that bolt hole where it was actually loose in the frame. So when we put that back on, we'll torque that derailleur and make sure it's correct on the frame. Quite a thick grease build-up on this, but it's actually not too bad. Everything on this bike cleaned up really nicely. It was surprising how little wear and how little damage really from being outside there was to this bike. It had survived that period of time quite nicely. I'm going to remove the front derailleur off the frame as well. Like I say, I'm going to actually treat the entire frame to protect it in the future, and also I'm going to put all these components through an ultrasonic cleaner to really clean them deeply. Some components I'm going to polish along the way, and so we need everything off the bike to do that. Next up, removing the pedals. Sometimes these can be a real issue. You'll see that in other videos that we've got on the channel, but in this case again everything was running smoothly with this bike. It was all coming off very nicely. Remove that center cap. This was a nice chromed finished center cap, so it was worth saving and making sure it goes back on the bike when we finished. And then we can remove those central bolts from the chain set itself before removing it off of the bike, so that comes off okay without any problems. You can see on the back of that there's a little bit of spot in there from corrosion, a little bit of rust marks on there. We'll clean all that up and make sure that that's nice before it goes back on the bike, and then we remove the left hand pedal arm. So same process as on the right hand, removing the center bolt, then using an extractor tool to get that off of that center spline there, so this removes it from there, and then we can actually work on the bottom bracket. You can see that area generally is very dirty. You always get a seepage of grease out of a bottom bracket like this, so it's a double-edged sword really, because it actually gives you a lot of dirt and debris in that central point, but actually also protects that paintwork in that center part, so that when you do clean it up, it cleans up really nicely. Bikes are one of the rare things that they have quite a few left-handed threads on them. You can see there, turning that clockwise to undo it, so it's a left-handed thread. And you can see there that we've got a build-up of grease. You can see how that grease has spun out towards the back of that bearing, so we need to clean that and make sure it's a even distribution of grease when we put the ball bearings back in. Now I'm going to remove these brake pads. They actually had quite a lot of wear on them, and I think it's because the rim itself had a patterning on it that would have been quite harsh on brake blocks. So both front and rear brake blocks were quite worn given how little wear this bike had. So this brake was a thing of beauty. I'll show you that on the bench, and this was one of those design features that this bike had of simplicity that I really enjoyed about this particular bike. There was 3 features on this that were very simplistic and very well thought out design in the nature of the way they've been executed. The brake on this was one of those, which I'll show you on the bench. So front and rear brakes coming off. So this is the front one. We cut the cables because we are going to replace all the cables on this bike, so we don't need to worry about those. Also, both front and rear original reflectors were on this bike, so I kept those as well. This is the front brake here. You can see survived very well, but it's bone dry where it's been sat outside, so there's no grease or oil on it, which is why it's creaking. So we will grease that later on and stop that annoying braking noise. Off come the shifters themselves. This is on the down tube. These are friction shifters, so this is pre-SIS type systems, so they have their own lugs that are brazed onto the frame, so quite a nice thing in their day. You can see I had to leave the last spacer off of the frame on both sides. That's where the elements had started to corrode this bike, but luckily we got to it right before they did any long-lasting damage. I'm going to remove the bottle cage. I actually kept this because it has that yellow that's picked up in the detail of the stickers. I think if you even wanted to replace that bottle cage, you'd have a job finding it. Now this was one of the design features I really liked about this bike. Very simple the way the cables just slotted in from the back, but there was actually a hole in the lever. So that lever was like a solid part with a central hole. You can see it there at the moment on the front, and it had that little hole that the cable just tucked up through and slotted in beautifully into its fitting. Very simple in its design, no problems there, really nice. And of course it had this early internal routed top tube cable for the rear brake that we put a guide through the frame to make sure that we could get the new cable in. Remove the old bar tape because you can see there it's a little bit deteriorated, a little bit broken, become unraveled at the top here, so we'll replace that when we put the handlebars back on. And then we just remove the shifters as well. We're actually going to alter the angle of these handlebars because they were tipped forward a little bit, and so we're going to actually replace the shifters in a slightly different spot on the handlebars so that everything there is a little bit more how it would have left the factory rather than this tipped up strange angle you can see there on the handlebars. They were actually solid inside the forks. Put a little bit of WD-40 through the top of the bearing cover, and fortunately for me they actually then came undone relatively straightforwards, so that was a little bit of a relief because these can really bind into forks at times. You can see the rust there as I lift those out. It was actually the fitting on the end of the quill, which you can see here on the bench, had rusted well into the forks, but thankfully we were able to break that out with a single tap of the hammer, and then we could work this out, and you can see we'll clean all this up. Next up I'm going to remove the saddle. Again, we've got something we're going to change there. We're going to alter the actual fitting the other way around to bring that saddle forward. It was a little bit odd the way that was fitted. And next up we need to remove the headset bearings, which you can see were extremely tight. That top cap was over tightened almost, very hard to undo, but we managed to get that off, and we'll clean those fittings up, replace the bearings, and make sure everything is absolutely spot on the front forks there. So that's the last lock ring off now, and I can slide the forks out. Both sets of bearings were integrated into their cages and they felt glued in. Each one felt like it broke off when I lifted it out. They were actually quite sticky. The grease on those, you can see here, have gone really sticky and tacky. That's going to really make you steer through treacle. It's going to be very hard to steer this bike smoothly. Very grimy. The grease had really gone off there. You can see how that's just picking itself up on my finger there. So we're going to actually replace all those bearings, clean up all these cups and all these fittings on the handlebars themselves. Clean that thread there with a little wire brush as well to make sure that everything will thread back on nicely. Blow it off with some degreaser and then wipe it off with a nice new microfiber towel. Same with the cups in the forks themselves. I'm using a little bit of wire wool there. The wire wool that we use is quite a nice soft one, so it doesn't scratch these cups. It just cleans up all the greases that are in there. So we're using our premium grease there. It's in one of our own premium grease syringes. And then fresh ball bearings. We're using loose ball bearings. We're not using races. I like to do that because it helps with supporting the headset bearing itself and also the smoothness of the steerer should that have had little grooves form where the old bearings have worn it. So fresh bearings all the way around, no races, and they go in beautifully. All these bearings are imperial measurements, so we measure those first and pick out the ones that are correct for the bike. We always pick the same size ball bearing as in the race, we just fit more of them, so they all go in nicely. On goes the cap and the pre-loader and the adjuster. We tighten that off, and then that is absolutely spot on. Now we can move our attention to the components, the first being this rear derailleur. There should be a cover on that jockey wheel both sides, it's missing, so we actually replace those as well along the way during this video from our spares. So we initially take this apart, and we'll also re-grease those, but these are all going to go through the ultrasonic cleaner, so we want this separated down as best as possible to help the ultrasonic cleaner along its way. I'm going to also ultrasonic clean these bearing cups, so out come the old bearings. You can see that thickness of grease, especially on that right hand one where I think they've been greased at some point, but that's starting to pull itself away from the bearings with centrifugal force and not being serviced quite enough, and so we'll also clean those up. So this is our ultrasonic cleaner. We're using a 6-litre ultrasonic cleaner. The beauty of an ultrasonic cleaner is it gives a little wave through the water that really agitates the dirt right down to the surface of the component. You still have to do a bit of cleaning, but it really lifts that dirt and debris off of the components, especially in the tight areas that you can't quite get to. You can then wash them down with a brush, or as we're using here, a little bit more of our wire wool to get the rust spots off of this component as well, and it really helps clean deeply. An ultrasonic cleaner is a must-have really if you're doing this kind of work. It's obviously a degreaser and not a rust remover, so I still have to go over everything with wire wool. These old components are super hardy, so wire wool doesn't scratch them in any way. You can see on the bottom bracket cup there's a few hard lumps of grease that I still have to remove, and then I just buff up the front and it looks like new. The chain came out great. You can't really see it in this shot, but you'll see it at the end. I also pulled it through a microfiber towel to dry it off, and that leaves it spotlessly clean and even reflective again. Now I'm going to polish a few of the components, and I'll start by stripping down the brake so that I can get to all the angles of it. And this brake was so simplistic. The fitting I've just took out had no bolt on the back. It used the threads in its arm itself to support it, and the back here, no nuts or bolts, no adjusters, nothing to preload or tension. You just remove the spring. It actually held both arms together without any spacers, washers in between them, and it was a lovely fit in that brake. Now I'm going to buff up all the aluminium parts to take the patina and the early layers of white corrosion that form on aluminium, to clean those off. I'm using a nice soft polishing mop here with a fairly soft polish on these components, so nothing too harsh, just a gentle clean off of the components to really bring off that patina and give that slight shine to them as if they were a new part, so quite a natural shine for this kind of thing. With a mop like this you could polish these parts until they look like glass, but to me that's not a natural finish for a bike component, not quite what you would have ever received a bike new. So I try to replicate how a part would have looked when it was new by polishing it in this form. You can see here the right hand brake lever's got that nice shine to it without being over polished, and the one on the left there has got the original patina on it, the original markings that we've cleaned off by polishing it the way we have. Put the front reflector back together. You can see again the right hand one I've polished the arm, the left hand one's original. Just helps take some of that corrosion off, just brings it back to that more natural original look. And the same with this brake. Each of these components have been polished. That lovely fitting goes in there, and that's all that holds that together. It needs no lock nuts. Such a clever design, such a beautiful thing this. Lastly, I have to put the spring back on, and even that was well engineered and straightforward. Sometimes these can almost be impossible to tension, but with this one it was weighted nicely. I just pulled the one side over with pliers, and that's the rear brake, now nicely buffed up. Putting on new brake blocks as well. All four of the original ones had cracked where they'd met the metal, and that was another thing very unsafe on the bike when it came in. On the other side here we're going to lubricate the pivot in the centre, and then I'm also just going to use a little bit of our silicone grease here on the slider of that spring. That will just help stop that squeaking noise that we had when we first used the brake, and that is now working and operating perfectly. Now this is actually a date wheel, so there's months dotted around the outside and then the date year in the center. So this is a 1988 part. The other brake was an 87, so we deduced that this bike must be an 88 and must have been produced around 87, 88. So we're happy to say this bike is a 1988 bike. So that's the way we dated this particular bike. Some hubs have dates on them, some other components have dates on them, but generally you can usually find a date on a bike to help you date the bike. I'm now lubricating all the components on this rear derailleur using there our premium grease to lubricate the spring, and then as I put this back together I'll also use a little bit of thread locker on the center of the fittings that go through the derailleur to stop those coming undone once they're on the bike. And then once I got that together I can then lubricate also the pivot points on the derailleurs. This one's a bit fiddly to put together. The spring and the bushing go onto the bolt that holds it all, and then that bolt has to be locked off on the other side of the derailleur with a nut. And the spring also has to come over a ridge to tension the whole derailleur, which again isn't hard, but it's a bit fiddly. And now that's the last nut going on to complete that rebuild. And then here we are with our syringes. You can actually buy these on our website. We have a shop there. We've put the link in the description below. You can go and visit. You can buy these syringes. It makes it very, very easy and quite satisfying to lubricate something in the fashion that we do. I use these on every bike I service, and it's always a pleasure to do. So it's a great way of supporting the channel and helping us out. General purpose oil there on the pivot points on this front derailleur as well. And then of course we do have this little pivot in the front brake there, so I lubricate that as well. And I'm going to just polish this bottle cage on the bench, just an easier way of doing it than when it's on the bike. And as that was sort of part of the original bike and also match the logos and everything on the bike, we want to give this a little bit of its own care and attention. Now I'm turning my attention to the pedals. These are actually quite a fiddly thing really. A lot of pedals I find on this era of bike are actually a non-serviceable item, and these were the same in that there was no adjusters for the bearings and there was no way of removing the adjusters that were put onto it to replace the bearings or to sort them out. So they have this cap that is knocked on, which I'm just going to tap off, and then under there is a one-way cone, so it can push on but it can't come off. You can see the end of that is knurled out. So what I'm going to do is just put a little bit of oil inside these bearings just to help free up any grease that is left in there, to make it a little bit softer and to help lubricate the pedals so that they can continue their journey. The bearings on these pedals actually felt quite nice anyway, so I don't think they needed doing, and I think they've got miles left in them. And then I just tap that cap back on to finish the work. What a massive difference. I buffed the cap, but I haven't buffed the body, so you can see how great the wire wool is. It does take a while to do, but I think it's well worth it to keep the original pedals going. So we'll also do the same to the other one, clean that up before we put it back on the bike. Next up, we're going to turn our attention to the rear wheel. First of all, I'm going to undo the cogs on this rear free hub. They were very, very tight, but they do come undone, so we use a lever here just to undo that first one that's locked on. Again, a left-handed thread so that it tightens up as you're pedaling, so that's why they become so tight. But a lot of people don't realize that these cogs will come off. These hubs that are sort of 5, 6, 7 speed hubs, you can remove the cogs to give them a deep clean if you need to. And there's two locking nuts on, or two locking cogs on this one, so remove both of those and then I can get all 5 of the cogs off of this one. You can see it was pretty corroded. A few of the cogs were sticky, but it all came off okay. And then I'll remove the actual hub itself off of the wheel, so we spin that off now, and then I can service this hub as well. So we've got the cogs off, we've got the hub off. This spoke protector here is certainly of the era of this bike, so we'll save that and clean that up. And again, this is one of those little design features about this bike of simplicity I really liked in the components that were on it, and that is actually this hub. So when I remove this, usually that has a cover over the bearings, a separate cover that you pop out, this right here. But in this instance, it was actually like a crimped over cover that was on the original hub, so I had to pull the bearings out from inside their own little space there, their own little void. It really was a nice design. Everything about this bike was how could they simplify the design, and I really thought this was a very nice bike of the period, which I really did enjoy. So I'm cleaning out those hubs themselves now to put new bearings in, so I've used a little bit of degreaser. I used wire wool inside because there's not much else I can get in there, and then I used a wire brush outside. As you can see, when I spray that off, yet again the quality of the components comes up like new after all these years. So another great transformation for this bike. Next up, I'm cleaning down the rim of the wheel. You can't see a lot here really, but we are using a little bit of our wire wool there, and I'm sort of working between the rust. So rust tends to bleed out, so you'll get the tiny micro dot of rust, and then it will bleed out and it will go brown around itself. And we can clean that back to the tiny dot in the center of the rust, and it makes a huge difference to the way the wheels come up, and they really come up shiny. And you just have to maintain that, you just have to clean them up. I find a lot of these bikes, when we restore them, they're not going to become daily riders, they're going to become special bikes, so they tend not to go as rusty again. And now it's time to open up that hub and fix all the wobbling we had at the start of the video. Again, another one of those left-handed threads here, so we need to turn that to the right to undo. So that's the cover for the bearings, that comes off. Then I can pull out the first set of bearings, they're out now, so that's good. And then we can lift off that cover and reveal the second row of bearings, which we now need to clean out. Now this hub actually was the part of the bike that suffered the most through the neglect of use and the years really, and it was right in this part here where the pawls are for the free hub. So out come the pawls there. You can see there's quite a bit of surface rust on them. They weren't too bad, but it was these springs. Unfortunately, these springs were life extinct. I'll show you in a second. So they were operating, but it was because there was so much packed in there of rust and grime, and everything was holding those pawls out. So they were operating, but not in a nice fashion. I had a job getting one side out. You can see here I'm in the middle of the struggle of getting that spring out. It was really hard to remove from the rust. There was definitely a lot of build up in there, and it made it very hard to get them out. But eventually I did get that second one out, and then I realized that actually they were life extinct. The spring is in two halves, so it's actually snapped right on its point, both sides. So you can see there, that should be one piece. It should be springing against itself. It's a little U shape, and it's actually snapped in half. Same on this side, the corrosion has got to this. So at this point, it may either be that the hub is life extinct, or thankfully for us, we had a couple of spare ones. So whenever we're doing work where something is to be discarded, we'll often pull it down, find some useful spares, and in this instance we had the useful spares we needed to salvage and save this hub. So again, into the ultrasonic cleaner, we put that on for about 15-20 minutes. I also cleaned up the spoke protector here, which I didn't put through in case it was brittle or fragile. The gloss and reflection on the original centre of that really was nice when it went back on the bike. Made a huge difference. You'll see that in the before and afters. A little bit of free hub grease here just to wipe in and make sure that everything pivots nicely when it's put back together. Fresh spring in there, and that's a nice little brass spring as well, so that should be okay moving forwards and not cause any problems to this hub. And certainly if it's serviced regularly, it will be absolutely fine. So in goes a new spring on this side, then that ball back in there. That's all now absolutely spot on and operating as it should. You can see there, it's got a lovely spring to it. These will operate so much smoother on the bike than original. Now I'm going to put fresh ball bearings all the way around. So set a line of premium grease around the race there, and then start working in the ball bearings. I get a lot of satisfaction out of doing these free hubs. It's really nice when you're putting all the fresh bearings in and putting it all back together with nice fresh greases. It's quite rewarding really. Using a little bit of our anti-seize grease here on the threads of the top half of this where the lock ring goes. Again, I'm always focusing on future preparations, and a little bit of our free hub grease around the ratchet. Those little pawls actually click against that ratchet, and that's what stops your wheel turning one way or the other. So we make sure that they're all lubricated as well. And then again, this second race where we put some fresh grease in and a fresh load of ball bearings onto that grease. This is another part of the job that takes a lot longer than it looks on camera. Getting hold of each bearing with tweezers takes a while. It's just slow going till it's done. A couple of little spacers there we pop back on. They will give a little bit of the movement and play within the hub, and then the hub goes on goes the lock ring. Again, remembering that this is a left-handed thread, so it's left to do up this time. Lock that off, and now we've got fresh pawls, fresh bearings, everything there as it needs to be. Use a little bit of general purpose grease here where the cogs go back on this one, so we'll wipe that in, and then that will be ready to receive the cogs back onto there. I've just put the free hub tool in the vise and then laid the free hub onto that. That will stop it rotating and turning, so we can now begin to lock those off. So that's the first set of 3 with the lock ring that they go on, and then we have the remaining 3 here, so we've actually got 6-speed hub here, and on goes this final one there, and that locks off as well. It just came up like new. It was really amazing. That very, very pleased. Going to lubricate and put in fresh bearings into the rear wheel. Again, you can see that there's that hub without the cover, it's all part of it. Really satisfying that. And in goes the axle. You can see in the center there how we've also cleaned up the hub, how the chrome is really shining out, how the spokes themselves are now all nice and clean, and you can just see in the background there the rim without any of that rust on it, and it's really looking quite nice now. So I lock off that axle, and now we can put the hub on the wheel. I'm using some copper grease to stop that ever corroding. You see how corroded these things can end up, and this grease will stay on the bike for life, so that hub will always be able to be removed again. And then I torque up that hub, which will be nowhere near as tight as it was before. Take a listen to this hub. It's hard to believe it didn't seize up before, and now it spins fantastically. Absolutely perfect. Really pleasing. So I'm going to remove the tyre because obviously we've got the rim to repair, and also we're going to put new tyres and tubes in this. I always think with these kind of restorations and the age of these bikes, fresh rubber is never a bad thing. So that's why we always do the brake blocks and the tyres and tubes, because rubber does deteriorate quite significantly with age. So we're going to make sure we've got fresh rubber on this bike all the way through. And you can see I've just slackened off the spoke. I'm going to give that a little tap and flatten it out. Simple as that. Doesn't take a lot, and then we can retension the wheel. There's quite a few spokes tight and too loose, and then we get a more even spread. I've gone within 10% tolerance on this wheel. It's not a race wheel, it's not a modern carbon fibre wheel. You can see there how off it was before. You're never going to get a wheel like this perfect, especially when you have the damage that we had on it. I got that pretty near really, and every spoke was within 10% of each other for tension, so quite happy really. We also did the front wheel. Everything there was okay. The front wheel came up just as good as the rear. I'm going to replace the rim tape on this one as well. There was actually a little break right by the valve one side, so it hadn't actually fallen off the wheel, but it did need replacing. So I'm using a canvas tape here. I prefer that really. It's self-adhesive, so it sits nicely in the center and doesn't cause any problems. And then I poke a new hole through that tape for the valve. So on goes a new tyre, brand new inner tube as well. These fresh tyres really make the bike pop out, and they went great with the blue paintwork on the bike. This inner tube did fight me a little, but it's all tucked in now, and I can get the tyre fully onto the wheel. I'm going to inflate the tyre before we put it back on the bike as well, and then obviously I do the same with the front wheel off camera, so I tend to do the wheels both at the same time. And that's the valve cap going on there. Another one of those 1% tidy ups that add up over the whole bike. And now it's time for the satisfying part of washing down the frame. So as I mentioned, the bottom bracket area and certainly around the rear wheel where the dropouts are, everything there is kind of protected from its own washout of greases and oils, but we need to protect all the frames. So I'm going to wash the frame down first. I'm using warm soapy water here and one of our detailing brushes. We use the big softy on a lot of the more modern stuff, but with this kind of thing I tend to use a detailing brush because it's a little bit more tactile. I can go around the lugs. Obviously these are soldered lugs and things on these type of bikes, so the detailing brush is nice for those finer details. And you can already see the depth we're going to get in that blue paint now that it's wet. As I dry the frame, you'll see that the paint mats back off and goes grey, which is why we polish them, to bring that shine back. I'm now going to polish the bike down with super resin polish. This is by Autoglim. Certainly on these old vintage type bikes where they have this beautiful paintwork. It really can lift these bikes and really make them shine and pop out. The top coat of the paint gets deeply impregnated with dirt, dust and UV damage, and polishing it takes off a small layer of that crusty top coat to reveal a fresh and clear layer that's much more reflective and smooth. And now I'm going to buff that off and reveal that fantastic paint. I'm using fresh microfiber towels each time, so fresh microfiber towel to really buff this off, and you can see how those logos and how the tubes are beginning to draw that reflection of light and how improved it is. But for the final touch, we're going to use the Auto Glim Rapid Ceramic Spray. This is an amazing spray. You spray it on and you buff it off, work with the buffing, really work at it. Sometimes these videos don't really show how much I've worked at this. I really give this a good buff, and it really puts that next layer of shine on the bike, but more importantly that next layer of protection. When you get water on this, you'll get little beads of water, tiny little beads of water. It really pulls up and protects that frame. Next up, I'm going to deal with the saddle. I had a few little flaky bits on it that I'm just going to sand off. This was actually a leather saddle, which is quite unusual for this style of saddle to be a leather covered saddle. But we're just going to clean that edge up there where it had a little bit of a knock or a little bit of a rub. And then I'm going to use some good old fashioned boot polish on this. It has a little bit of dye in it, so it helps blacken it back up. And also it has the nutrients in it to really help this leather to remain supple and well treated. So we left that to sit on there, and then we will buff that off and make sure that it is nice. And you can see there how it's blackened it up a little bit and really help that saddle, and will help it long term with the nutrients and everything that are in that polish. Now I'm going to deal with the handlebars. Again, a little bit of our wire wool just to clean those up. Obviously the bar tape covers up an awful lot of that, but you can see how that chrome is still in very good condition, and how the stem itself is all in very good condition. So nothing wrong with this really, and we can just clean that up. Even the nuts and bolts on this one were rust free, so that was quite good for us. And I'm also now putting in fresh bearings into the bottom bracket cups. So in goes some premium grease, bearings, and then another layer. You can never really over grease the bottom bracket bearings because they're spinning so fast and that grease can come out. So it's always good to give it a good layer of grease in there. That's the drive side cup now in and locked off. I'm using some anti-seize grease here on the threads of the bottom bracket as well. That will help these cups spin in, and more crucially help them come out for the next service as well. So lock off that lock ring once we've got the tension correct, and now we can begin to rebuild the bike. Note the reflection on that chainstay there, how that polish and protection of the ceramic spray has really lifted the spirits of that paint. Once again, the chrome components go back on, and I'm really happy with how it's now all adding up. And then I put those plastic caps back on the pedal arms, which I cleaned up off camera. Chain set on now, that cleaned up absolutely spotless. We'll do a spin test in a minute, but initially that bottom bracket felt buttery smooth. Torque up the pedal arms as well. I do that at this stage to pull everything in tight to make sure that the front derailleur is adjusted correctly, and then we're not going to then suddenly pull in the chain set after we've done those adjustments. A little bit of our anti-seize grease here on the pedal arms before the pedals go back in, and they absolutely spun in beautifully, which was really nice. And then we can torque those up towards the end of the bike, and look at this, look. This spun up for so long, we're showing it 2 times speed. It just kept spinning and spinning, so it's much better now than when it came in. Carrying on with the rebuild though, the front derailleur on this also had a nice fitting that screwed into itself, and then the rear on as well. Torque up the rear derailleur because obviously that was loose, and we do have this little plastic cover to go in, so it's hard to do it afterwards, so make sure that that was torqued up as well. On go the shifters. I don't grease the shifters at all. They're called friction shifters for that very reason. The idea is that they hold themselves in any position to hold your gears. On goes the back brake, putting that original reflector back on. We've got the new brake blocks on there. Again, when I talk about fresh rubber, very important to replace brake blocks when you're doing a service like this, otherwise the brakes just don't work. The bars go back in. I'll torque that up at the end along with a couple of other bolts to finish the restoration. I'm just going to alter the angle of the front bars there. They were tipped forwards quite a bit, so alter those to get that more horizontal in line with the top tube of the bike. It will just aesthetically look much nicer when we finish the bike. And then on go those lovely brake levers as well. We've got this fresh internal routed cable outer. We do kits of cables. We do them in white as well, which is harder to find, but we do sell them in a white kit and a black kit that come with all the cables, ends, inners, outers, everything you need to recable your dream classic bike like this. So do check out our website for that. These fittings here that go in the brakes, they're very important not to lose those when you're doing a restoration of this nature, because they're very rare, quite unusual and very specific to this bike. So if you have odd fittings like that, be very careful with them when you're doing a restoration of this nature. In goes that back cable there. This is a lovely stainless steel cable. I use a guide here that I make up, and it makes all the cable ends the same length without physically measuring them. So you can see there I've just got a double-ended piece of cable there, the right length, and then I can use that for all the cables and they all end up the same length, which is kind of a little detail really, but it's what makes a difference in restorations. So you can go the front and rear derailleur cables. Again, we're using our super slick stainless steel cables here. I always think cables really make a difference to a restoration as well. When you see fresh cables running down a down tube, they really reflect nicely. A lot of these bikes actually use galvanized cables originally. Stainless steel cables will always outshine those on a restoration and look really, really nice. In goes the cable. I route that through a little channel in the bolt and then pinch that up. Again, using my cable guide there for the rear derailleur. I don't use that on the front though, because the front needs to be shorter, otherwise it will tap the chain set each time it turns. Fresh set of bar tape onto this one. I'm using cork tape here. Again, it really lifts the bike. The original tape was actually damaged anyway, but making sure that this tail end here actually fits at the bottom of the handlebar, so it doesn't finish at the top, it finishes right there at the bottom, so that it can't be seen from the rider perspective, and also it just presents the bike a little bit nicer if that all finishes around the bottom. I'm going to use a little bit of anti-seize grease here in the frame fittings for this bottle cage, and I've actually put fresh bolts in there as well, so that just finishes it nicely. And then I'm going to turn around this saddle mounting clamp. There's an axle that goes through there, so I have to pull that out to flip it all over. Again, I felt that with this one, it was sitting a little bit too far forwards on the bike. It just didn't look aesthetically quite right the way the saddle was mounted before, so I've turned that round and that now is as it should be. So do that up and line it up and everything there is good. On go the wheels. Front wheel first. You can see how that's already spinning in its own bearings. Really, really nice. Fresh tyres. Look at that wheel. What an amazing difference we've made to that. And then we put on this original chain. Put a new quick link in this, but as I mentioned before, the chain had no stretch in it at all. It was ready to reuse. We managed to clean all the rust off it, re-lubricate it all up, and that is part of the heartbeat of the original bike. So very, very nice. Changing gear beautifully. You can hear here quite a satisfying sound. Very, very nice. You have to get a little bit used to friction shifting. They're not quite as easy as modern bikes where you click and click and click and away it goes. You have to get a feel for them, develop a feel for your own bike. Front derailleur working perfectly. Really, really very satisfying. And then of course we've also got that lovely free hub and brakes that are no longer squeaking and working very, very nicely. Wheels that are true, and headset bearings. You can see how free and easy that is now. That'll steer beautifully. The bike will just feel like a brand new bike. You'll be took back in time when you go on this bike and thoroughly enjoy it. There are a couple of fittings here we can torque up. So the crown bolt on the handlebars, the quill on the stem, and obviously we have had the pedals off of the bike, so we can torque those up as well. Most of the rest of the bike is actually done with nuts and bolts, so you do those by feel. And you can see here what a huge difference we've made to this bike, how the chrome has come up nicely, how the aluminium parts we've polished up and look really good. The rust on these rims has lifted away. Really quite an amazing difference. These old fittings really do clean up beautifully. Once they're lubricated and serviced, you can get years out of these bikes. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do like the video. If you're watching this on a TV, the button is down and across. That really helps the video and the channel, so thank you for that. Please drop us a comment as well. We love reading your comments and they really do keep us motivated, especially on an epic job like this. And then finally, hit subscribe. Thank you for watching and we'll see you again soon. Bye for now.